You know what keeps me up at night? At what point does a sitting president's cognitive decline become so severe that we have to acknowledge that he's no longer operating the office? Someone else is, and that someone is a ideological ghoul who makes Machiavelli look like a fucking kindergarten teacher? The slow cremation of executive function. A president, hollowed out. There's a particular kind of horror that settles into your chest when you watch someone, slowly lose the capacity to operate in the world. Not suddenly like a stroke or a traumatic event, but incrementally, day by day, each erosion so small that everyone around you keeps insisting that everything is fine, that this is normal, that you're just being paranoid about the erosion of presidential competence. Except it's not fine. It's a slow-motion catastrophe we're all watching unfold with the kind of detached horror usually reserved for watching a building collapse in real time on the evening news. Stephen Miller exists in the periphery of this collapse, or rather he doesn't exist in the periphery at all. He's dead center, hand buried up inside the presidential puppet, working the strings like a deranged puppeteer in a fever dream scripted by Sartre at his most nihilistic. The man has the haunted eyes of someone who genuinely believes that every policy emanating from his brain is a sacred mandate handed down by some vengeful god. Those aren't the eyes of an ideologue. Those are the eyes of someone who has transcended ideology into pure, unfiltered obsession with power and its application. Consider the mechanics of this thing. The absolute shit-fuckery required to manufacture reality so completely that a sitting president can't distinguish between actual images and deep fakes, between decades-old photographs and fresh fabrications. We're not talking about someone with occasional confusion. We're talking about someone so completely disconnected from baseline reality that sophisticated manipulation becomes nearly indistinguishable from truth. That's not decline. That's not normal aging. That's someone whose grip on consensus reality has become so tenuous that it barely registers as human cognition anymore. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "Man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does." But what happens when the man in charge isn't actually responsible for what he does? When he's so compromised cognitively that he's essentially operating as a biological interface for someone else's will? Does Sartre's framework even apply when we're dealing with a presidency that's been hollowed out and repurposed as a delivery mechanism for one man's ideological fever dreams? In a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Incorrectly attributed to George Orwell, but capturing the essence of what happens when consensus reality itself becomes a contested territory, when information becomes a weapon, and when truth becomes just another policy option to be selected or discarded based on ideological convenience. The theory that writes itself. Deep fakes, teen interns, and the complete abandonment of reality. Here's the thing that keeps circulating in the darker corners of political discourse, and it's plausible enough that it deserves serious examination. Miller has some kid, probably some ideologically committed teenager with a workstation and knowledge of consumer-grade AI software, creating fake videos designed specifically to feed Trump's increasingly fractured understanding of current events. Sounds insane? Absolutely. Sounds impossible? Not in the fucking slightest. The barrier to entry for this kind of manipulation has evaporated. You don't need military-grade technology. You don't need access to classified production facilities. You need a laptop, an internet connection, and software that's available for free download. Some kid could be sitting in a coffee shop somewhere pumping out convincing deep fakes specifically calibrated to trigger Trump's particular brand of cognitive vulnerability. The dumbass-faced efficiency of such a scheme is almost beautiful in its simplicity. Consider the evidence. Trump gets visibly angry and confused by a simple label on an image, something that any cognitively intact person would immediately recognize as a text overlay, a caption, something added in post-production. But Trump? He treats it like it's a mysterious tattoo that suddenly appeared, something requiring explanation and investigation. His brain can't compute the basic visual literacy that a 6-year-old could manage. He's sitting there confused by what amounts to fucking word art and nobody in the room has the spine to say, "Sir, that's just text someone added. It's not real." We moved on from that moment way too fucking quickly. We laughed, made our jokes, and then scrolled past like it was just another day of presidential incompetence. But it wasn't a glitch. It was data. It was a demonstration of how completely Miller could manipulate someone whose cognitive architecture has been essentially demolished by age, narcissism, and whatever the fuck else is happening inside that deteriorating skull. The technical demonstration is almost obscene in its accessibility. Go to Clipa or ClipDrop. Upload your video. Use whatever AI tool is trending on Reddit. Drop the manipulated video into the system. Boom. Done. Anyone can do it. Even Stephen Miller, that ghoulish bastard who looks like he was designed by someone's fever dream about what evil should look like if it walked on two legs and spoke in that distinctly reptilian monotone he favors. Bertrand Russell once argued that the problems of the world can only be solved by taking into account their complexity. But Miller doesn't see complexity. He sees opportunity. He sees a president whose grip on reality is so compromised that he can be fed any narrative, any image, any fabrication, and it will slot seamlessly into whatever delusional framework is currently operating his brain. That's not governing. That's not leadership. That's psychological warfare conducted against the sitting president of the United States by someone inside the executive branch. The architecture of manipulation. How a broken brain becomes a tool. Here's where the theory becomes genuinely terrifying. Trump's cognitive decline isn't a bug in Miller's system. It's a feature. A perfectly calibrated feature designed to maximize control and minimize resistance. You can't argue with someone who doesn't understand the argument. You can't negotiate with someone whose memory erases contradictions the moment they're inconvenient. You can't challenge someone whose relationship with truth has become so completely unmoored that facts are just noise in the signal. Miller has essentially won the lottery. He's got a president whose brain is fundamentally broken in exactly the way that makes him maximally manipulable. Every conspiracy theory that gets fed to Trump finds fertile ground in a mind that has been stripped of the cognitive architecture necessary to evaluate information. Every deep fake that gets whispered into his ear becomes indistinguishable from lived experience because his neurological capacity to distinguish them has essentially evaporated. The beauty, and I use that word with genuine horror, of this arrangement is its invisibility. Miller doesn't have to stage some dramatic coup. He doesn't have to issue orders in the traditional sense. He just has to occasionally enter the Oval Office, feed Trump some piece of manipulated media, and watch as the president's fractured mind transforms it into policy. The cock-wobbling efficiency of it is almost elegant if you're psychotic enough to appreciate it. Consider Trump's increasingly disconnected statements about reality, the constantly shifting narratives, the inability to maintain internal consistency from one day to the next. These aren't signs of someone gradually declining. These are signs of someone whose information environment has been completely hijacked. Miller controls the flow. Miller controls what images reach Trump. Miller controls what news gets presented to him. Trump, sitting in whatever room he's confined to, becomes a kind of biological algorithm. Input fake information, receive policy output. The dumbass-faced predictability of Trump's responses only makes sense if you understand that they're reactive to carefully managed stimuli. Show him a manipulated video of migrants doing something he associates with danger. Watch his brain connect neurons that probably shouldn't be firing anymore. Witness the policy directive that emerges as a result. That's not governance. That's operant conditioning conducted on a national scale. The elderly and the presidency. A national security catastrophe. This brings us to the much larger conversation about senescence and executive power. We need to have a brutally honest discussion about whether anyone cognitively compromised enough to be fooled by consumer-grade deep fakes should have access to the nuclear football. That's not ageism. That's not discrimination. That's basic operational security, and a fundamental commitment to not having the most powerful military on Earth controlled by someone who can't distinguish a text overlay from a tattoo. The cognitive decline on display isn't anomalous, it's predictable. It's the inevitable consequence of allowing someone in their late 70s with documented narcissistic personality disorder and what increasingly appears to be neurological deterioration to occupy an office that requires moment-to-moment decision-making capacity. We're not talking about someone who's sharp but slightly forgetful. We're talking about someone whose grip on consensus reality has become so compromised that he's essentially operating inside his own constructed narrative, a narrative that Miller can shape and mold with almost no resistance. The national security implications are absolutely apocalyptic. If Miller can feed Trump manipulated information and have it immediately converted into executive action, then Miller effectively controls American foreign policy. Miller controls military deployment decisions. Miller controls which countries get invaded, which get sanctions, which get offered tunnels to Alaska for no coherent reason. That's not a normal power structure. That's a coup conducted so softly and so completely normalized that nobody really wants to acknowledge it's happening. Martha Nussbaum wrote about the importance of cognitive capabilities in maintaining human dignity and functioning within society, and what we're witnessing is the systematic stripping of those capabilities from someone whose job demands maximum cognitive functioning. Trump isn't just declining, he's being declinated. He's being systematically fed information designed to further disintegrate his already compromised ability to process reality. It's elder abuse conducted at the presidential level, and we're all complicit in normalizing it. The theory becomes documentation. When speculation becomes obvious, the question isn't whether Miller could be doing this. The question is why anyone would assume he isn't. A man with Miller's ideological rigidity, his proven contempt for democratic norms, his demonstrated willingness to operate outside legal frameworks, would he hesitate to manipulate a president whose cognitive decline had essentially removed the primary obstacle to his agenda? The scumbag-faced brilliance of the scheme, if it exists, is that it's fundamentally unfalsifiable. You can't prove a negative. You can't prove that Miller isn't generating deep fakes. You can't prove that every piece of information entering Trump's cognitive sphere hasn't been carefully manipulated. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It's evidence of competent operation of a system designed to leave no obvious traces. Miller operates with the particular intensity of someone who genuinely believes that his ideological vision supersedes all other considerations: law, democracy, human suffering, constitutional constraints. That's the personality profile of someone perfectly positioned to engage in this kind of systematic manipulation. He's not doing it for personal enrichment. He's doing it because he genuinely believes that he's serving some higher purpose, that the ends justify any means, that a president compromised enough to be manipulated is actually preferable to one who might question his directives. The technology is consumer accessible. The target is cognitively vulnerable. The operator has both motive and opportunity. The only missing piece is documentation, and documentation would be invisible by design. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is logical extrapolation from publicly observable facts. The machinery of consent. How nobody stops this. The truly fucked up part, and I mean this in the most technically accurate way, is that absolutely nobody has the political capital to stop this if it's happening. Republicans won't acknowledge it because it would mean admitting they've essentially handed control of the presidency to a mid-level ideologue. Democrats can't effectively call it out because the narrative immediately becomes unhinged conspiracy theory in the media environment. Miller's already thoroughly compromised. The media itself is too fractured and too aligned with various power structures to mount any kind of unified response. So the machinery grinds on. Miller funnels carefully constructed reality into Trump's deteriorating brain. Trump responds with policy pronouncements that reflect nothing but whatever was recently injected into his cognitive environment. The shit-ass-faced competence of the operation is that it doesn't require anyone to do anything dramatic. It just requires everyone to continue pretending that this is normal. Continue acting like a president who can't distinguish deep fakes from reality is simply having a bad day. Continue normalizing the incremental hollowing out of the presidency itself. Isaiah Berlin wrote about the dangers of ideology untethered from democratic constraint, and Miller represents the apotheosis of that warning. An ideologue with direct access to executive power, operating through a president too cognitively compromised to resist, creating a system where policy flows directly from ideological conviction, without passing through any of the messier checks and balances that democracy theoretically provides. The end game. What happens when the puppet master becomes the president? Here's the nightmare scenario, and it's probably already happening in some form. Miller doesn't need to maintain the fiction of Trump as president indefinitely. He just needs to maintain it long enough to entrench his ideological victories into governmental infrastructure. Once sufficient policy has been locked in, once enough judges have been appointed, once enough executive orders have restructured the bureaucracy, the specific question of who's actually making decisions becomes almost academic. The dumbass-faced genius of this arrangement is its self-sustaining nature. The longer it continues, the more entrenched it becomes. The more entrenched it becomes, the harder it is to disrupt. And Miller, sitting in that basement office with his pale skin and his dead-eyed ideological certainty, probably watches it all with something approaching satisfaction. We've essentially handed the nuclear codes to a technocratic authoritarian through the intermediary of a president whose cognitive decline has rendered him incapable of meaningful resistance. That's not a bug in our system. That's a catastrophic feature revealing itself in real time, and we're all pretending it's just another day in the news cycle. The theory that Miller controls the narrative, that he's feeding Trump manipulated media to manufacture consent for predetermined policy, isn't conspiracy theory. It's logical inference based on available evidence. A president cognitively compromised enough to be fooled by obvious deep fakes. An ideologue positioned to feed him reality. Technology available to anyone with a laptop. Opportunity, motive, and means all converging on a single point of extraordinary vulnerability. And the most terrifying part? Even if this is exactly what's happening, nobody can really stop it. The machinery is designed specifically to prevent interference. The documentation is invisible. The victim is incapable of recognizing his own victimization. And the perpetrator operates with the absolute certainty that he's serving something greater than democratic constraint or presidential autonomy. Welcome to governance by deep fake and ideological coup. Apparently that's just what we're doing now. The shit-fuck-faced dystopia has officially arrived, and we're all just kind of going along with it.